Well, hello everyone. Thank you all for being here. Also, thank you for having me here. It's always a pleasure to get to talk about Cuba and the Cuban Revolution. I think it's safe to start by saying that the world knows the Cuban Revolution. The revolution of 1959 belongs to one of the landmark moments of the 20th century. The faces of the revolution, like Fidel Castro and his brother Raúl, and Che Guevara, are seeped into history as repeating images of Cuba. In the Cold War, the world knows and actually still remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis. We assimilate the Cuban Revolution to the United States, to foreign politics, to superpower struggles, to a David versus Goliath battle at a time the world was holding its breath. The world knows well these representations of the revolution through politics, through diplomacy, through charismatic leaders. But behind these images, we know less about the revolution on a Caribbean island as it has been lived and experienced from within. We know remarkably less about lived experience, the daily course of Cuban lives in the revolution. Many of the social histories of Cubans in the revolution have remained silenced by the dominant narratives of the revolution and also hidden from scholars because of the silence of Cuban archives. Among the unknown histories of the revolution are the histories and experiences of Cuban Catholics. In a communist state with a long history of atheism, religion remains an unexisting paradox. Dynamics and exchange from religion to revolution and vice versa remain unexplored at large. Experiences of Cuban Catholics, priests, sisters and brothers in religious orders, seminarians, lay people remain unexplored. Religious meaning-making of the revolution, internal life and discourse of the Catholic Church, all of these are histories still undiscovered. Like I said, in Cuba, archives of the revolution are not open for scholars. I am myself the first scholar to access archives of the Catholic Church in the Cuban Revolution, archives that are still officially classified. You can see me sitting on top of a ladder, reading sources that have never before appeared in international scholarship. You can imagine how exciting that is. With more than 40,000 pages of previously unstudied sources, my work explores histories of Cuban Catholics living and discussing the revolution. These unexplored sources, some of which, a small sample you can see on the screen, reveal a myriad of Catholic voices, Catholic experiences on the island. They show us how Catholics have navigated their lives between religion and the revolution, how their individual stories have been shaped by this reality, how the Cuban Church has navigated and negotiated its existence on the island. And furthermore, they show us that there is indeed mutual exchange and interaction, that religion has not been isolated from the revolution, nor has the revolution ignored religion. As my study shows, these are also encounters and histories not recognized well enough in scholarship. A look into these histories, Catholic histories of the Cuban Revolution, opens new perspectives into histories of the revolution as a whole. Social histories and histories of everyday life reconstruct voices from within, voices of the everyday, voices of Cubans, voices of real experiences. These histories shed light on the ways the revolution has been lived and experienced by Cubans in the everyday. And as such, these human histories tell more layered, more nuanced stories of the revolution. Ultimately, also histories of Catholicism and Cuban Catholics in the revolution reveal us and point us towards unexplored histories that still remain silent. They show us that we might know the Cuban Revolution, but we don't know everything about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra, and thanks for this. So, you mentioned that you were the first and also the only researcher who has gotten the access to that quite big pile of material you just showed us. How did that happen? How did you manage to be the first and the only one?
That is a good question, a question I hear quite a bit. I always answer that it happened over a cup of coffee. That's something connecting Finland and Cuba, the love of coffee. As the archives are not open, as they have not been explored before, there is no official protocol for how to access them. There is no protocol, no structure for how to enter the archives. I started by spending time in Cuba, on the island. Altogether, I've spent 11 months living in Cuba. And the first months, I went from door to door, from one Catholic office to another, asking if there are archives and if we could maybe start negotiating access to them. And a lot of time that happened over a cup of coffee. And I think it's important to say it out loud, that a significant factor was actually the true human encounter, of dialogue, of encounter, of discussion, establishing a common ground, building mutual trust in course of the process.
You are a researcher, but you're also a priest. You're also a woman.
Yes.
And the Catholic Church doesn't approve women as priests or even acknowledge the Lutheran priests. How did this affect your research, or did it?
That's another good question. It did. In fact, it did affect my research quite a lot. I think it's an interesting position I'm in as a scholar of Catholicism in the Cuban Revolution, that at the same time, I am an insider and an outsider. In Cuba, for the Cuban Revolution, I'm an outsider. There is a significant geographical, cultural, political, ideological distance from Finland to Cuba. So, in terms of the revolution, I'm an outsider. But in terms of Catholicism, in some sense, I have been seen as an insider, because I am a scholar of religion, a scholar of theology, and I am an ordained pastor. So for the Catholic Church, that accounts as a positive factor, enabling a specific type of communication and perhaps trust to build on.
I already mentioned in my intro that you've been hanging out with the Pope, meaning that because of your research, you also got to take part in the visit of Pope Francis in Cuba 2015 as a officially appointed observer. How was that?
That was very nice. So I was invited to participate in the visit by the Cuban Catholic Bishops' Conference. They invited me because of my work on Catholicism in Cuba. And I participated in the events of the papal visit, and then I followed the papal trail around the island. And of course, it was wonderful. The visit was quite remarkable and generated a lot of hype in Cuba, because it was a continuum of a longer process. In 2014, Cuba and the United States re-established diplomatic relations. And what was perhaps not known as well as it should have been, was the role of the Catholic Church in the process, that it was actually Pope Francis who initiated the dialogue between Presidents Raúl Castro and Barack Obama, and the Catholic Church served as a mediator in the process. So the visit of Pope Francis came as a culmination of that development, and in a sense he was received in Cuba as a part of the process of opening, a process of new hopes, awakening on the island, and it was absolutely wonderful to get to see that up close as a part of the group coming together.
We already saw the pictures of the material you had, and you mentioned, what was it, 40,000 pages. What did you do with those pages? Did you read them all? So how was your work done in practice?
In practice, I have spent quite a lot of time in archives. Usually when you say that you're doing field work or doing research in Cuba, people start to think about beaches and mojitos. Actually, it's archives from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Long days in the archives, taking photos of each and every paper. So I have everything photographed, organized on my computer.
Thank you, Petra.